This is the Literacy Mindset Podcast, where education leaders discuss identifying and removing phonological barriers with Mindplay's CEO, Jeff Pendleton.
Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. Very excited to have my guest today, Dr. Michael Taylor, who is the Director of Special Education in the Bryant School District in Bryant, Arkansas. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, excited to have you. It's an interesting time. Michael shows up with the jacket on. I thought for sure maybe he was visiting south of the equator because it had to have been a different time of year. But no, have confirmed that we're both in 100 plus degrees today, and he just prefers a little bit more warmth in his life. So we won't dive into it any more than that. But why don't you give us this, a quick intro and some context for the audience of what you have going on in Bryant?
Well, I'm the special education director here at Bryant Schools. We're a pretty medium-sized district for Arkansas. We have about 10,000 students in the district and about 1,800 kids pre-K through 12th grade who receive special education services.
Excellent. And your background has always been in special education. Did you start as a special education teacher and kind of come through, or what was your trajectory?
I started as a regular education teacher. I was a high school Spanish teacher, and then I navigated into the world of English as a second or other language, and was in that world for quite a while. And then I migrated over into special education, and then into special education administration.
Okay. Was there something about sort of Spanish or ESOL that inspired that, or it was just I needed change, and that was the jump?
Well, whenever I first started teaching Spanish in high school, I quickly realized that the students who I couldn't reach had disabilities, and a lot of those disabilities were language-based disabilities. And so I was like, I've got to do something to figure out how to reach these kiddos. And so early on in my career, I went and got a master's in special education, but more so because I wanted to become a better regular education teacher, not because I saw myself fully migrating over into that world. But as life would have it, I landed in the world full-time.
There it is for you to take. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about literacy. That's my favorite topic. That's why we have the podcast. We talk about it a lot, and I always love getting different angles from different roles within the district. So, as a special ed director, what is it that you think about relative to either people, processes, or the content, the curriculum itself? And what role do you play in decision making for the curriculum that comes in, or influencing or supporting the curriculum? Maybe a couple parts there.
Yeah. Well, a lot of those conversations begin, all of our kids first and foremost are regular education students. And so we never lose sight of that. And
Okay.
for that reason, they should be thought of from the very beginning when those conversations start taking place with district leaders who are overseeing all kids throughout the district. And certainly that's what we try to do here at Bryant. And so obviously there are some different ripple effects that take place with every decision that's made when we're looking at making some curriculum changes. And so usually we come into the process a little bit later, just because as they start to assess and evaluate some different curricular options that are out there, then they start to think through what will this look like for our students with cognitive disabilities? What will it look like for our students who have language-based disabilities? And how do we serve those students differently using this curriculum? And that's when we kind of get voted into the conversation.
Okay.
And then we kind of go on our own evaluative journey and helping to add some value to that conversation about what we see as barriers that we need to help solve. And then from there, together, it seems like we make some pretty good decisions about which would be best to serve kids and how we can go about creating that type of programming for them.
Got it. When you think about barriers that you see, sometimes we talk about them as barriers to reading success. Do you find commonalities or buckets that you kind of put them in that you would say these two or these three are the more common barriers, or is it just so vast and there's so many individual ways to pick up reading that you really don't see any pattern on those barriers?
Well, I definitely think we see a connection amongst our students who come in with language delays. It's
Okay.
pretty amazing to me the amount of students in our district who have language delays. And back in the day before I got into special education, I really thought like a language delay was like, some special like extraordinary diagnosis that was being given to
Right.
kids. And then later on, I was like, wait, you really mean like a language delay just means the kid didn't pick up as much language from the family as some other kids, did at his or her age. And so that was pretty eye-opening to me. I think, we could go into the research. I know there are a ton of studies about that topic, but I think I see that as the most impactful with our kids. It really
Okay.
does matter the vocabulary that those kids come in with and all of that experience they have before they even walk into a public school or into a private school or wherever it might be. The words that are being used by that family and the diction and the syntax and all the structural language that goes into that child, it really does impact, in my opinion, whether or not those kids are going to be prepared to be skilled readers in kindergarten and moving on.
Got it. And when we talked a little bit about, obviously you just described the curriculum team makes the decision on sort of the core ELA or reading programs that might be studied. And then if something happens, that's when call in your team to sort of come to the rescue. And maybe there's an MTSS or an RTI process around intervention around there. Can you talk about your team's role, what it is that you typically get called in for? How do you guys partner with the curriculum team and the local leadership at the building to help with intervention?
Well, first and foremost, all of our kids have IEPs, and obviously that is the catalyst for everything that we do with their programming. And so, our curriculum team in special education, we work closely with our teachers to make sure that the goals or the objectives that are being targeted in those students' IEPs are actually tied back to good data. And all of the data is available to us through regular education. The teachers are already doing that progress monitoring from week to week. And so it's available at our fingertips. And sometimes we can lose sight of making sure that the program is directly tied back to the data that we have at our disposal. And so we're really involved in those conversations with teachers, making sure that that it's data driven. In terms of when problems come up, I would say our kids are going along just like any other regular education student, and they're getting tier 2, tier 3 level supports, which are already in place in all the schools. But when we don't see those kids responding to those interventions in the way that we would have thought they were going to, or some other kids in that same group are responding,
Right.
then it causes us some pause and hesitation. And there are a lot of, sometimes they decide to do some regular N type of diagnostics through dyslexia. And then after they do that, they might be like, okay, based on the regular education criteria in Arkansas, the kids might not be hitting for having characteristics of dyslexia, but we can do a comprehensive evaluation using the patterns of strengths and weakness model, which is what we use here at Bryant. And through the PSW process, we can see that the kids, even though they might not have a strong cognitive profile, we can still see where there are cognitive deficits that explain some of those underachievements that they're having in some key academic areas. And we do see some characteristics of dyslexia or something else that might be going on. And so
Yeah.
I think that's really how we come into the fold more than any other way.
Okay. That's an interesting point. Maybe we can dive in a little bit deeper. When you think about your role at the local district level, you think about state level requirements. You mentioned something about dyslexia, maybe dyslexia screening sometimes, or state legislative bodies that make decisions on that. And then, of course, IDEA and federal legislation relative to that. How do you segment out the differences in what you do being sort of local level choices that you make versus state level driven decisions versus, compliance or oriented federal decisions?
Well, that's a loaded question. However, I will say that, I think the Department of Education, Arkansas, really, I really believe they do their very best to trying to provide us with some really meaningful guidance that will help us make good decisions for kids. However, when it comes to IDEA, if we go to due process or a parent's upset and they disagree with us, ultimately we're going to go back to looking at federal law and federal legislation and determine whether or not we met the mark for that kid. And so I never lose sight of looking at it through both lenses. And sometimes there are some legislative issues that come up at the state level that seem, at the surface level to maybe conflict with some federal legislation that's out there. And so it's our job as special education directors and as informed leaders that we have the ability to differentiate between those laws and what's out there so that we can make sure we're still doing what's right by kids, still trying to adhere to what the state thought was important while still following the federal law. And so it's, and sometimes we do have kids who, based on the criteria set by the state, they probably wouldn't come out as students with dyslexia, who have characteristics of dyslexia. But like I said, the IDA allows us to use a lot of different ways to determine SLD. You can use discrepancy, you can use RTI, and then you can use the PSW process. We use the PSW process because we feel like it leads us to the right answers on kids. And so I would say that.
I love that. And I appreciate you diving into the challenging question, maybe, or loaded question on that, because I don't think that at times we understand or we empathize enough with the complex level of decision making that has to happen, right? You always want to do right by the kids in front of you, but you do have state level legislation and federal law that kind of has to be a driving force. So that's great and very helpful to think about. What does it look like for your staff or Bryant in general relative to just science of reading instruction? What teachers know about it, how involved they are in it, how much of it is like, oh, that's that department. Just, I know that there's been a little bit of a push to get science of reading vocabulary and pedagogy inside of the minds of all teachers, but kind of walk us through what that looks like today.
I think it's pretty cool. At a minimum, all of our teachers have awareness of the science of reading, and many of them have gone through many, many days of training to be fully informed about the science of reading. And then, of course, we have countless speech language pathologists in the district who are running around, and that's their field. I mean, they're already experts on the science of reading. Which, is sometimes forgotten in the world of special education.
True.
To tap into the resources that we already have surrounding us. And so it's pretty cool today to see that shift over the last several years. I would say 8 years ago, many folks, even at the elementary level, I don't know that they always felt quite equipped to have those conversations around reading deficits and around how to program for kids who present with those types of deficits. But it's really cool to be part of those conversations today, because when I look around the table, I see an informed group of people who feel comfortable navigating that conversation. They seem to know how to pull the right tools out or the right curricula that might be needed to address those deficits. And so that's pretty cool to see that shift taking place. People just seem a lot more informed and a lot more comfortable making those decisions around kids.
Right. And we see that a lot at the K-5 level. Is that true? And Bryant, even beyond that, you kind of mentioned that a lot of teachers are experiencing that. Is that request or required of 6-12 teachers?
Well, I think in Arkansas, one of the things that stood out whenever they started going down the path of the science of reading and making sure that everybody, was informed in that area, it seemed like a big reminder that kept getting made to everyone was looking at our students who are graduating and how many of them come out of, high school as proficient readers.
Right.
And I don't know an educator out there, special education or non-special education, who wouldn't hear that and not pause and reflect on that.
Right.
That's a sad reality if there are any kids who leave high school. I mean, and they're not talking about kids with profound disabilities. These are kids who, in spite of their circumstances, we as great educators should have been able to take them along a path to help them become proficient readers, to enter the workplace and in the real world. And so I think that's something that really stood out to people. All to say, at the secondary level, our are they still growing in that area? Do they understand every bit of phonics and phonemic awareness and everything? Well, no, and not
Sure.
all of them are providing direct instruction in the area of reading, but do all of them have an awareness today about looking for the signs there are kids sometimes, believe it or not, who are referred or are already in special education, but are further identified as having deficits because teachers have more knowledge than they did 5 or 6 years ago. And they're raising their hand and bringing that to different folks' attention saying, hey, little Johnny's getting by just fine in class. But have you ever pulled him aside and really tried to listen to him read out loud? Like, there's an issue here that we need to solve. And I'm not sure that was the conversation 6 years ago,
Right.
So I think that awareness is pretty impactful, actually.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it. That obviously we talk a lot about not just or going beyond awareness, because there's so much that can happen in those grades. But I'm intrigued now just at the value of awareness, right, and how much it can produce relative to potential interventions just by being aware of things that are in front of you. Yeah, that's an interesting point. So in your experience, you spend a lot of time now in the special ed side of the world. How reasonable is it to expect that most students can graduate as proficient readers? Is that a fairly obtainable goal, or are there a certain number of students that's not a reasonable goal?
I think for the students who aren't in that very tiny population of the students with the most profound cognitive disabilities, I think it's very feasible to expect that a district should be able to produce proficient readers. And I think there's also a difference between proficient and fluent readers.
Sure.
Being a proficient reader for a non-reader, that's a huge difference, and so
Right.
I do think that districts should be tasked with that. And, as many say, reading is a basic right, that all students should be owed. And so I think it would be, it would be very dismissive of me to come to any other conclusion except that the district should be tasked with, helping students to become proficient readers before they leave our district.
Yeah, and it wasn't intended to be a leading question. It's just simply an observation. Like, sometimes we have to recognize that maybe that's not a reasonable goal for at least a certain amount of the population. But like you're saying, it's a pretty small percentage of the population that wouldn't be a reasonable goal. Okay.
Yeah, it is. I think there are some unique challenges that come into that, though, that we're finding. It's like, on the surface, you think, oh, wow, we started the Wilson reading system several years ago at this point now. And so when we first started thinking about this, we were like, hey, we're going to be living well one day because all of our little guys and little girls are going to grow up to be big boys and big girls at the high school. And they're going to have gone through this program and they're going to become proficient readers. However, I will say that one thing and it wasn't that it was lost on us, it was just that initial excitement took over about, wow, we're going to be able to accomplish this. But, kids transferring in and out and the high mobility rates of kids, I don't think that's something that especially paid attention to at the beginning whenever I had that initial wave of excitement about what we're going to be able to accomplish. And I think that is a barrier to kids. We have kids coming in who land here in the 10th grade or the 11th grade, and they haven't had the same continuity of instruction. They might have, many of the kids are faced with challenges that we can't even imagine, between, foster care or maybe great loss in their life or whatever it might be. And so it's those challenges that arise for us whenever you have a kid who shows up in the 10th grade and he didn't get to experience what you provided to the other kid who's been in Bryant since the first or second grade getting that type of intervention. So then what do you do to, where are the catalysts available to that kid to help that kid become a proficient reader in such a limited amount of time? So does that make sense? To me, that's
it makes a lot of
conundrum.
sense. Well, it makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate you kind of exploring that. We didn't talk about this a lot, but what does technology look like in Bryant, and does it become an important part of literacy acquisition, or is it sort of an afterthought? How is it viewed within the district?
Well, the state has purchased like Read and Write. They did that a couple of years ago for all of the all of the districts in Arkansas, and they've definitely been pushing for UDL, and all of us know that UDL has great merit, and there's definitely a place for UDL in all of our classrooms. And so technology is definitely one of the modes for implementing UDL, I think. And here's the thing. I mean, when you look around at the kids who come to us today, I mean, whenever I was in high school, I went to some pretty advanced high schools. They were using smart boards and all those things. I had a cell phone I was texting on every day. I lived in that world. But then I look at the world that we're living in today and look at AI, and I don't get scared about AI. I get excited for the possibilities for what it can do. And so when we think about technology, I think sometimes we think about technology in terms of, is there like a reading program that we could put kids on and they could, do that for 30 minutes of enrichment a day? And I don't think about technology in that way. For example, we have a student who is visually impaired, and we have many students who are visually impaired. And some of those students have elected to use other assistive technologies, like, AI has come out with these like smart Google glasses and these different types of smart eyewear, and they can read for you, and they can read handwriting, and they can help you figure out what's in front of you and what's beside you. And, what a transformational tool for that kid.
Right.
And that's a reading aid and a reading assistant for that kid who, the kid doesn't want to. We have kids who are proficient in Braille, but just because you're proficient in Braille doesn't mean that you want to use it as your preferred mode of reading. That just might mean that you have that skill and ability. So giving kids the autonomy and the voice to navigate that in their own way, to me, that's a benefit of technology. And assistive technology is always on the forefront of the decisions that I try to make for kids here at Bryant. I don't think it's going away. I think it's only going to get more and more complex, and the kids are going to work really hard to stay up to date with that complexity. And I think that as leaders, we have to do that same work. So,
yeah, no, I appreciate that. And since you brought us to the conversation of AI maybe and allowing us to forward think, we could talk about this stuff all day long, but we'll wrap up with the final question. And that is, let's pull out the Dr. Taylor crystal ball, right? And give me something that 5 to 10 years from now is either the same because that's how you like to predict the future, or something you wish were, or you hope for to be changed, or something that will change, and you kind of give us a sense of where you think we'll be in 5 to 10 years.
That's also a loaded question. Well, here's the thing. I'm about to fly out to DC in a few weeks to spend a week out there advocating for change in special education. And so what I do think is that in 5 and 10 years, we'll still have IDEA, and there will still be federal legislation around special education. So I think that will be here. What I think will be changing is technology, and I can imagine a world where we have some specialized robotic systems or whatever it might be who are helping to provide aid and assistance as like a supplementary aid and support for kids. Like I go to restaurants these days and they bring my food to me, a robot does, and hands it to me on the table. So, I mean, why could I not see that same thing, translate into the educational world where there's that aided assistance available? And I don't know what the limits are on that. I don't know what the maximums are on that. But, and obviously with anything, you need appropriate boundaries, and so certainly we don't want things to get out of hand, but at the same time, I think we have to see the value in it too and how it can transform kids. So I would say technology and AI is definitely the thing to watch. And as far as the federal legislation, it might change a little, but I think it's going to be there.
It stayed pretty same. I like that. Well, I will say this is the first time that I have had someone suggest potential robots in the classroom as assistive aids, and I love it. I'm here for it. I think that sounds fantastic. It could get a little creepy, but it could be awesome. It could be great and interesting. I've loved the conversation. Thank you so much. I really hope that we get to do it again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much.
If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love to hear from you. Learn how we help students by identifying and removing phonological barriers at mindplay.com.